the middle of March of 1907, a sailor named Nels Nelson stood at the bow of this big Russian steamboat called the Perrier, and he looked out over the Pacific Ocean with a very worried look on his face. The sun was starting to go down, and Nels was afraid of what the night might bring. About a month earlier, the Perrier, the boat that Nels was on, had left Hong Kong and begun its long journey to California, where Nels and the rest of the crew would offload all their hemp and machinery. And just that day, the Perrier had passed by Honolulu, Hawaii, which meant they were nearly to their final destination. Now, their long voyage thus far had been quiet, but now Nels just couldn't help feeling like their luck was about to run out. Nels had been a sailor his whole life. He was originally from Sweden, but he'd traveled all over the world, and a few years back he had linked up with the Perrier in Hong Kong. And now, other than the captain of the Perrier, who was a Russian named Kavinsky, Nels was the longest-serving member on board the Perrier. And what that meant was Nels and the ship's captain were the only two currently on board the Perrier who knew the ship's dark secret. Now, Nels and the captain had not told anyone this secret and didn't intend to. Now, this wasn't something they planned, like they weren't trying to keep it a secret. Instead, it was just kind of this unspoken agreement that we're just never going to talk about this. But at the last port in Hong Kong where the ship was docked, the previous entire crew of the Perrier, minus Nels and the captain, had all deserted because of this secret. And so now Nels and the captain were left to kind of keep this information to themselves and go out and solicit a new crew to come on board the Perrier to go to California. But they did it without telling these people about this dark secret. And they'd managed to do it. Nels and the captain had found this kind of ragtag bunch of sailors to come with them on this journey, but as a result of recruiting basically anybody with a pulse who was willing to go on this voyage, the crew they ultimately recruited was kind of an untrustworthy, sketchy bunch. On this night, it was Nels's turn to stand watch, which means basically you would stay up and kind of patrol the boat and look out for problems or emergencies. It was just a way to make sure the crew was always safe, even when everybody was asleep. And even though Nels was not exactly thrilled to be staying up all night to stand watch, in a way he actually was kind of relieved to be in charge of this task. He figured he'd rather be awake and miserable than asleep and vulnerable. Suddenly, another sailor came up to Nels, and Nels hadn't heard him, and the sailor slapped him on the back and said, "Hey, how you enjoying your sunset cruise tonight?" Nels turned around and saw it was another crew member just kind of pulling his leg, and so Nels attempted to put on a smile and kind of go along with the joke and make it kind of lighthearted, but he was really struggling because he was looking off to the horizon and he could see the sun had nearly set. For the next couple of hours, Nels and this other sailor would stand by this railing in the cold night air, and they would just talk about, what they're going to do when they get to California, and, what they plan to do with their lives generally, and just kind of small talk, normal stuff. And, for a little while, Nels did forget about all this extreme anxiety he was having about nighttime. But at some point, as Nels and this other sailor were just chatting away, there was this warm breeze that kind of came across the deck of the ship. Now, remember, it had been very cold all night, and so this warm air really stood out. And the second Nels felt that warm air, he knew his worst fears were about to be realized. And so Nels was so scared about what was about to happen that he just kind of froze. He couldn't even turn and tell his partner what was happening. And his partner was totally oblivious because his partner had never been on the Perrier before and didn't know the ship's dark secret. And so this other sailor just kept on blabbering away, totally oblivious. But then, as Nels is frozen to the spot with fear, from down below in the ship, where the crew was all sleeping, they heard this loud, guttural scream, like one of the crew members was being tortured or something. And right away, the guy next to Nels, the other sailor who had been with him, he stopped talking, because now he knows there's a problem. He doesn't know what it is, but obviously something's wrong. Now, Nels was still frozen with fear because he knows what's happening. He knows what's gonna happen. And so he was just standing there, and the other sailor is like, "Nels, what's going on? We gotta go down there." But it wasn't until more screams began coming out of the berthing area down below that Nels kind of snapped out of it, and he was like, "All right, come on, we gotta go." And the two of them, they went bombing down the steps down into the berthing area, and they went into the first compartment where these screams were coming from. And when Nels and his partner walked into this room, they looked and they saw two of their crew members were sitting on one of the bunks, just completely rigid, as if they were totally stiff. And the two of them were just screaming as loud as they possibly could in perfect unison, but it was like they weren't there. It's like their eyes were staring off into the distance and they couldn't control their bodies. Now, Nels knew what was going on here, but the partner didn't. And so the partner's looking at Nels like, what's going on here? And Nels just turned to him and said, look, I think we can quarantine them. Help me move them. And so this partner has no idea what Nels is doing. He doesn't understand what's going on, but he kind of jumped into action with Nels. And Nels and this guy, they grabbed these screaming crew members who were totally stiff, and they remained stiff as Nels and the other sailor dragged them out of the room, down the hall, and they put them in what's called the hold, which is kind of like a jail cell on board a ship. It's where sailors who misbehave get sent to. And so it's a place you can put things and lock the door and they don't come out again. Nels' thinking was, if we can take these affected crew members and quarantine them in the hold, maybe, just maybe, this won't spread to the rest of the crew. But as soon as Nels had shut and locked those two men inside of the hold, it was like the entire ship erupted with screams as the entire crew, minus Nels and his partner, just began screaming like mad. It was like the ship was total chaos. And so Nels and the crew member, they began running down the hall trying to figure out where the screaming was coming from. But before they knew it, the rest of the crew were streaming out of their rooms into the hallway, just screaming and running their way upstairs to the top deck. And so Nels began telling himself, stay calm, it's okay, it's not happening to you yet. But then it felt like someone had reached up inside of Nels' chest and was squeezing as hard as they could. It was like his body was being possessed by something, and then he felt this pressure building up inside of him, and then it was like, without even trying, suddenly the loudest scream that had ever come out of Nels came out of his mouth, and he was completely powerless to stop it. And seconds later, Nels, screaming at the top of his lung, along with his partner, who was also screaming, they joined the stampede of other screaming crew members running their way up to the top deck. And when Nels and his partner reached the top deck, as they were screaming and screaming and screaming, Nels looked around and he took stock of what he was seeing. Again, he's literally screaming this entire time and can't stop it. And he's seeing that's what everybody else was dealing with. There were sailors who were clawing at their faces, almost like they were trying to stop themselves from screaming, but that wasn't doing anything. Others were holding their throats, attempting to stop the screaming. Some others were running into walls and grabbing and fighting with each other. I mean, it was absolutely chaos. And so Nels, he's kind of taking stock of this whole situation, still screaming, and then he notices one sailor in particular, and Nels knew exactly what was going to happen. That one sailor, who Nels did not know well, he was one of the sketchy crew members who were picked up in Hong Kong, he stopped screaming. And Nels could tell because there was this look of absolute calm over this sailor's face. And he was down on all fours, almost like an animal, right out in the middle of the top deck. And Nels, as he continued to scream, watched as this young, now very quiet sailor started to move across the deck like an animal. And as he did, he got faster and faster, like he was galloping on all fours, and he was headed straight for the railing of the ship. Now, Nels, in his conscious mind, he knew what was going to happen next, and he wanted to stop it, but just like he couldn't stop his own screaming, he was powerless to stop what was about to happen to this young man. And sure enough, Nels watched in horror as this galloping young sailor went full speed to the railing and then just leapt clear over it and splashed into the water below. And the second he hit the water, it was like everybody on the ship broke out of their trance. The screaming stopped, and it was eerily quiet. And one by one, each of the crew who had kind of broken out of their trance now began looking around, having no idea how they just wound up on the deck and what was even going on. And they looked at each other to try to figure out, like, do you know what just happened? But nobody knew. And then this very tense silence was broken when one of the crew members who had seen that young man gallop and leap over the side, this crew member, he yelled, "Hey, man overboard, someone jumped over." And it was like that was the thing that everybody was going to focus on. We're going to forget about this absolute craziness that just happened, and we're going to try to rescue this guy. But despite lowering down rowboats and paddling around for nearly an hour and yelling out for this guy and turning their ship around over and over again, they never found him. He never made a single noise, nothing. He just vanished into the night. And that was it. And so after about an hour of searching, the search was called off, and this sailor who had leapt over the edge was declared dead. And once he was declared dead and the rest of the crew were all back on board the Perrier, standing on the top deck, looking around like, what just happened? Nels and the captain looked at each other and nodded, because they knew they would have to tell the crew what just happened. They would have to share this ship's dark secret. And so Nels and the captain told the crew the big secret, and the crew was obviously horrified, but considering they had just been through the entire experience, they weren't exactly surprised. They just hoped that, this night was the only night this craziness would happen. But the following night, the same thing happened. Everybody screamed, went crazy, ran up to the deck, somebody leapt overboard. The next night, same thing happened as well. The next night, so 4 nights in a row of this, the captain just could not take it anymore, and when he heard that first scream echo through the ship, the captain grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired. In early April, the Perrier finally reached San Francisco, California, where the crew was supposed to offload their hemp and machinery. By this point, one of the sailors, whose name was Padaman, had assumed command of the ship, but by this point, the crew were very close to mutiny. They did not want to be on the ship anymore. They didn't care who was in charge. And in fact, once the Perrier got even just within sight of land, there were 9 sailors still on board the Perrier who stole one of the rowboats, lowered it down to the water, and just paddled to land to get away from the Perrier as fast as they could. They didn't even ask to be paid. They just wanted to get away. Nels and the few remaining crew members on board the Perrier docked it in San Francisco, California. They unloaded the hemp, and then the crew actually got back on the Perrier and set sail again and sailed to Santa Monica, California, which was not a very far distance, where they would offload the machinery, so the rest of their haul. And actually on the morning that they were supposed to actually dock in Santa Monica, the crew's cook leapt overboard to his death at 2 a.m., and the crew barely reacted, because by this point, this was just commonplace on board the Perrier, people going crazy and jumping over to their deaths. And so once the Perrier was docked in Santa Monica and all the cargo was offloaded, Nels and the rest of the crew just left it there. They totally abandoned it and just left. And the Perrier would remain totally abandoned in this dock in Santa Monica until a reporter from the Chicago Tribune newspaper found out about what had happened on board the ship and the fact that now it was totally abandoned, which seems so creepy, and he decided to dig into this, and ultimately he published the story that I'm telling you right now. Here is the Perrier's dark secret that both Nels and Captain Gavinsky knew all too well. 3.5 years earlier, on a night in the fall of 1903, the Perrier docked in what was then called Bombay, but what is now known as Mumbai, India. And on this particular night, some of the crew members of the Perrier decided they wanted to leave the boat and go have some fun. So a few sailors and an officer hopped on one of the rowboats on board the Perrier, they lowered it down to the water, and they paddled to shore. And apparently, this group of guys had a great time on shore, but at some point, the officer apparently killed a guy on land. Who knows what it was about? Nobody knows. The reporter from the Chicago Tribune couldn't figure it out. But the rumor goes the officer killed someone, and when they came back to the ship that night, the officer was bragging about killing this person and even making jokes about it. Now, we don't know if this story actually happened, and we also don't really know if this is the seminal event that prompted what would become the dark secret of the Perrier. But very shortly after that officer had killed someone, the Perrier had left Mumbai and they were out at sea and it was very cold, but then suddenly the crew remembered this warm air wafting over the boat, and then screams rang out from inside as the crew began going totally crazy. This was the first appearance of the Perrier's dark secret, which sailors on board the Perrier actually just referred to as the Thing. Nobody ever saw the thing, or felt the thing, or heard the thing. The only thing they experienced before all hell broke loose is a warm breeze would come across the ship, and then seconds later it was absolute pandemonium until one of the crew members died. And usually it was like the thing inhabited one of the sailors, like that young man who ran like an animal and leapt over the edge, and this thing would basically inhabit these sailors and cause them to take their own lives. Over the next few years, more crews would join the Perrier and go out to sea, and over and over and over again, this thing, the dark secret, would take over, and many of the crew would end up dying. And so by the time the crew had come to port, the crew would totally mutiny and disappear. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near this ship. That was why Nels and Captain Gavinsky were the longest serving members on board the Perrier, because they were the only ones who were willing to come back. All told, the thing, or the dark secret of the Perrier, claimed the lives of 23 sailors. 20 of them, after screaming like maniacs, suddenly just went quiet and leapt over the railing into the ocean and drowned, and the 3 others that passed away were the ship's captains, who all killed themselves. After the Perrier was abandoned in Santa Monica, California, it's unclear what actually happened to it, but we know it never sailed commercially again. One night, in a cemetery in Alabama, this woman was visiting her sister's gravesite, and her sister had passed away when she was only 6 years old. And so this woman had really never gotten over that. And so as she's sitting by the gravesite, she begins to hear what sounds like kids laughing and playing and singing songs. But it's the middle of the night and she's in a cemetery, and so she was very confused by this, and so she decided to go investigate. So she got up and began walking through the cemetery towards the sound of these voices, and sure enough, on the other side of the cemetery was a kid's playground, and it was full of kids playing and singing and laughing. And this woman is like, what are these kids doing here? It's the middle of the night. But before she could figure out what was even going on, she heard a scream behind her. She turned around and saw nothing, but then when she turned back around, all the kids were gone. And so this woman is totally horrified. She fled the cemetery, and then that night when she was laying in bed kind of going over what happened, at the foot of her bed, she thinks she sees something moving. And so she looks down her bed, and slowly the head of a child appears at the foot of her bed and stares directly at her.
Isaac was this salty Army veteran. He had served in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is an elite paratrooper division. He taught survival training classes, but more than anything, he loved to hunt. And he actually hunted in this one particular area in New York all the time with the same group of friends. In fact, for like 55 years, Tom and his 6 hunter friends would hunt this one area. On November 15th, 2015, Tom and his hunting buddies decide to go hunt in this area. And they got a bit of a late start. They didn't get out there till about noon. So they decided, in order to make up for lost time, to use this technique that's referred to as a deer drive, where you have stationary watchers that set up on a line about 100 meters apart from one another, and you have a group of drivers that kind of corral any deer or any animals in the area and push them so that they go past the watchers who can take a shot at those animals. And so Tom, along with 3 other hunters, were made watchers, and they set up along this hillside where Tom was all the way on the left flank, which meant on his left were no hunters. He did have a hunter 100 meters to his right, and then there was 2 other hunters all the way up the hill on the right as well, but he was on the outer flank of that line. And the 3 other hunters that were going to be doing the driving were to his right as well. Behind this hill, they were going to try to push the deer up and over this hill down to this line of watchers. After 3 hours and no luck, they haven't seen one deer, they start to also comment on the fact that there doesn't seem to be any wildlife at all. No squirrels, no birds, no anything. There's just silence, which is very odd for this area. And when you consider that this group has hunted this area for 55 years, they have a really good understanding of what normal looks like. And before anything happened with Tom, they were already talking about how strange that was. Also, one of the watchers who was right next to where Tom was, about 100 meters away, he recalled hearing a very distinct sound, like a whooshing sound or a snapping sound, coming generally from where Tom was. But he didn't think much of it at the time. That is, until they got back to their cars after calling off the hunt because they had been unsuccessful, and everyone's there except for Tom. And they go back out, they're yelling for Tom, they're wondering, did he fall down? They're like, okay, let's radio him, because everybody had radios. There's no answer from Tom. They're searching the area where he was. They start shooting their rifles into the air. They can't find him, and they think, okay, well, we don't know what he's doing, but this guy is super competent. He was healthy. Let's just go to the cars and wait for him. And so they're sitting at the parking lot, which is not very far from where they were hunting. And this is an area they always parked in, and this is an area they always hunted in. So they knew that Tom knows where they're going to be. And so they sat there waiting and waiting, and he's just not showing up. So eventually, the hunters call it in to the rangers that he's gone missing. A massive search is launched for Tom. I mean, they are combing this area. They got helicopters, professional search teams. They're looking in lakes. They're looking under logs. They're looking everywhere. And there's not a shred of evidence of Tom. They can't find his walkie-talkie. They can't find his gun. There's no clothes. There's nothing. He's just disappeared. On the 4th day of the search, the FBI shows up and they get involved in the search, which didn't make any sense because why is the FBI getting involved 4 days into a search for an elderly hunter where there's no sign of foul play? Why are they getting involved? It didn't really add up. And all they would tell Tom's wife is that they believed that something was off about this case, and that's why they were there. But they couldn't elaborate unless more information came in. But nothing ever shows up. Even though Tom was a bit older, he literally taught survival classes. He was the guy teaching other people how to survive in the woods. He also has been hunting in that particular area for 55 years. How is it that he in no way was able to signal that something was wrong, and that all these people, including the FBI, can't find any trace of him? It just seems like something is off. 7-year-old Jeannie Hesselschwert was living with her fiance, Mike Monahan, in Arlington, Massachusetts. The couple had been together for 10 years, and their family said they really loved each other and they were a great couple. In July of that year, Jeannie and Mike left for a planned trip to Yosemite National Park in California to go backpacking and sightseeing. On July 9th, the couple arrived at Yosemite and they entered via this road that was only open during the summer. So as such, it was totally desolate and they were the only ones on this road. And they had about a 2.5 hour drive until they reached the spot they were going to actually stop at. So they had the scenic drive up the road, and about 2 hours into this drive, there was this turnout on the side of the road where a couple of other tourists were standing and sightseeing, and Jeannie and Mike decided they wanted to pull over and get out and stretch their legs. So they pulled over in the turnout, and when they got out, Mike said he wanted to walk down the trail a little ways to this area that apparently was good for bird watching. And Jeannie didn't want to do that. She wanted to walk in the other direction up to this overlook. And so they decided that they would each get to do their own activities. They'd be gone for 15 minutes and then meet back at the car. So Mike heads down and does his bird watching. And then after 15 minutes, he walks back up to the car expecting to see Jeannie, but she's not there. And this is 1995. Neither of them had a cell phone. And so he can't just call her. And so he just stands by the car and waits. And so he's looking around, waiting for her to reemerge out of the trail she had left on. But after 15 more minutes goes by and he still hasn't seen her, he walks up to some of the tourists that were there in the first place and he asked them, hey, have you seen this woman Jeannie? And he described what she looked like. And they said, no, we haven't seen her. And so he goes back to the car and now he's getting pretty anxious and he's looking around and he's just waiting for her to show up. And another 15 minutes goes by. So now she's 30 minutes late and he starts walking up the trail to see if he can find her. But he realizes the trail immediately spiders off in different directions. And so she could have gone in any one of these different pathways. And so at this point, he decides, I have to get authorities involved. Time is of the essence. And so he runs back to his car and he sees a Park Service employee emptying a trash can into a dumpster. And so he runs over to them and he says, you know, my fiance, Jeannie, she's gone. She's been gone for 30 minutes. Can you please get in touch with authorities and get people up here looking for her? Within 45 minutes of speaking to this employee, park rangers had made their way up to this area and they began talking to Mike and figuring out where she might have gone, and they start walking down the trail to look for her. But after an hour of not finding her, the park rangers would call in additional assistance from the police. The search for Jeannie would become the largest in Yosemite's history, expanding to 40 square miles, with helicopters overhead and dog handlers on the ground and hundreds of volunteers combing this whole area. But despite the relatively quick response time and massive amount of manpower, they could not find Jeannie. After 2 weeks of looking everywhere for her, the only thing they were able to find were 2 boot prints that they believed belonged to Jeannie. The first print was found in the vicinity of where their car was parked, so where she had actually disappeared from. And then the other one was curiously located on a trail that was one of the biggest trails in Yosemite. It was very well marked, it was fairly wide. You're not going to mistake this for anything other than a trail. And the boot print was not walking along the trail. It was cutting across it, as if she was going from wood line, crossing over the trail into the other wood line. This second print didn't make any sense to authorities because they're thinking, you know, if you're lost out in the middle of the woods and you come across a clearly defined trail, a really obvious trail, you wouldn't walk across it and go back into the woods. you would take the trail in either direction until it hit civilization, because all trails do that for the most part. And so it seemed like this print could not be hers, because that would indicate she has chosen not to follow this path. But the print was hers. Over the course of these 2 weeks of searching, several dog teams had been placed right where Mike's car had been, right where Jeannie had left to go to the trail where she disappeared. And the dogs could not pick up a scent of Jeannie. And it led the handlers to believe that Mike was actually lying and that Jeannie had actually never been in Yosemite. And this was all a big ploy because he had done something to her and he was going to act like she's lost in the wilderness and he was going to get away with whatever he did to her. And so ultimately the FBI got involved because now foul play is being suggested. And the first thing the FBI did is they polygraphed Mike. And he passed without question, and he was totally vindicated of any involvement. After that, the FBI dug into Mike's background and Jeannie's background to see if there was any indication of somebody that might want to do Jeannie harm, and they couldn't find anything. She was just gone, and nobody knew what happened to her. On September 3rd, so 2 months after Jeannie went missing, 2 men were in this really remote section of Yosemite to go fishing when they spotted a human body in a pool of water. It would turn out to be Jeannie's. She was 3 miles from where she was last seen by Mike at that trailhead. She was only wearing socks and 1 boot, and she had been sitting in this pool of water for so long that they were unable to determine a cause of death. Initially, it was speculated that she must have fallen into the river that fed ultimately down to where she was found. She must have fallen into that river, miles away, close to where she went missing. Maybe she fell and hit her head and was unconscious, and then she drowned, and then she wound up here. But park officials said there's too many debris along this waterway that her body would never have been able to get down to this spot. But if she didn't drift to that spot, it meant she had to have gotten there on foot. And to get to this particular spot, according to the fishermen that were interviewed after they found her, the only way to get there is to climb up a cliff with climbing gear on, or scale down a cliff, again, with climbing gear on. The only people that go fishing in this area are mountain climbers and rock climbers that have the equipment to get there. From where Jeannie went missing, she would have had to climb down 2,000 feet of cliff face to get to this spot, and she did not have climbing gear. And so when that seemed really unlikely, the next theory was, okay, she must have been abducted and they brought her here. But that means your assailant would have had to carry Jeannie down this 2,000-foot cliff, which also seems really unrealistic. The most widely accepted theory was put forth by a tracker that was involved in this case. They went out and they surveyed the area where Jeannie would have been, and they noticed that the sound the wind made when it passed by this particular clump of aspen trees, when the wind hit the leaves in the trees, it sounded like a car driving by. And so they speculated that maybe, Jeannie, she's scared, she's panicking, it's nighttime, and she hears this sound and she thinks she's hearing a road. And so she would have walked towards the sound of, the car, which really was the leaves, and she would have disregarded, for example, the trail. She would have walked over the trail because she's trying to get down to this road. She's kind of fixated on this road. And at some point, she could have potentially wound up at the side of that cliff that would have led down to where she was found. And then she could have slipped and fallen over the edge and landed in one of the rivers that would have flowed down to where she was found. But park officials and authorities were a little bit skeptical of this theory because for her to have landed in a stretch of water that did connect to where she was found, it was almost like she would have had to leap off the cliff to land in that stretch of water. It wouldn't have been just falling over the edge and then you're landing in this water. It would have been more of a jump to get to it. So the idea that, Jeannie is running and leaping off cliffs, that doesn't really add up either. But park officials and authorities, they don't have a better theory. In fact, no one has a better theory. We're just left with a lot of questions, like how did she wind up in this inaccessible area? Why didn't the dogs pick up her scent? Why didn't she take that trail down to safety? Why did she cross over it? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. Bunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave, which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24th, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, enter Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to this section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decide to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the birth canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just got to go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again, and his chest expands, and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip because he's now moved past it. He can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck. And from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's gonna go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time, everything's going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is going to take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is going to take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200 pound man out of this tiny space, that's going to take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. Didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs, and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. And so they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. And here is a picture of John exploring Nutty Putty Cave before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful 1-year-old Darren Mitchell was living in southeast Texas in a town called Navasota. He was serving in the U.S. National Guard, he was the proud father of a 1-year-old little girl, and he was engaged to the little girl's mother. Anyone that knew Darren knew his main goal in life was to support his little beloved family. While he personally really wanted to go to a trade school, he ended up putting his dream on hold to raise money so his fiance could go to nursing school. And their plan was after she completed nursing school, Darren would then raise more money and go to school himself. That spring, southeast Texas was hit with record rainfalls. It seemed like for Darren, every time he went to and from work, the sky was always gray and the road was always wet. But of all the thunderstorms that passed through that area that year, there was none more powerful than the 24-hour thunderstorm that began on May 26th. That afternoon, Darren was on his way home from work. He was traveling along Texas State Highway 105. It was raining so hard that his windshield wipers literally could not keep up with the amount of water hitting his windshield. And so he eventually just had to slow way down just to make sure he didn't crash into anyone. He looked around him and the fields and the ditches next to the road were already filling with water because the ground was already completely saturated from all the rainfall over the past couple of months. Before long, Darren found himself stopping right in the middle of the highway behind this huge row of traffic. Apparently there was some significant flooding up ahead on the road and people were hesitant to drive through it. And so after a while, when this huge row of traffic was just not moving and the rain was just continuing to pour down, Darren started to worry he might be in an emergency situation, that this could be a flash flood scenario. And so he called his brother and he told him that he was stuck on Highway 105 because there was flooding up ahead, there was flooding behind him, he couldn't really go anywhere. And so his brother asked him, what are you going to do? And at some point Darren said, hey, I can actually get out my window, so I'm fine, I'll talk to you later. But after that, nobody heard from Darren. And later that afternoon, when Darren didn't make it home, his family got really concerned and they called the police. And so that night, a search was launched to find Darren, but there was no sign of him. But the next morning, they did discover Darren's blue pickup truck. It had flipped over. It was off the side of the highway near a river that had been created by the floodwaters. Darren was not inside of the vehicle, but 24 hours later, they did discover his body. He had drowned and he had drifted 1 mile downstream of his truck. The family was obviously devastated by this horrible loss, but they just could not reconcile how he had been on the phone with his brother saying that he was going to be just fine to just a couple days later being found dead. And it would turn out there was actually a witness that watched what happened to Darren. She had been caught up in this flash flood as well, except she was in a vehicle that did not get swept away. And so she was watching Darren as the floodwaters raged around his vehicle, and she said he climbed out of the window and he got into the bed of his pickup truck, and then from the bed he moved up to the roof of his truck, and at this point the waters began pulling his vehicle, and so his vehicle became unsteady, and from her perspective it seemed like Darren did not like his odds on the roof of his truck, and so he climbed back inside of his truck. And then just a couple of minutes later, his vehicle was dragged into a deeper section of the water and it flipped upside down and was pulled under, and Darren did not reemerge. With this information, Darren's family was able to figure out that when Darren climbed back into his truck right before it flipped over, he posted something to Facebook that now, looking back at it, is unbelievably haunting.
A father and his young son were out for a walk in their small suburban town just outside of Barcelona, Spain. When they reached their downtown, they were going to turn around and walk back home, but the boy pleaded with his father to make a quick stop at the old theater. The reason the boy and many other kids in the town loved going to this old theater was because out front of it was this huge papier-mâché statue of a dinosaur, a stegosaurus to be exact. And so after a little bit of convincing, the father finally agrees and they start heading in that direction. After they turn the corner and could actually see the dinosaur statue, the boy took off running while the father just stayed back and walked leisurely, watching his son the whole time. And as he's watching his son, he can see he gets right up to the statue, and then the boy just kind of suddenly stops and stares at something on the bottom of the statue. And so the father notices his son has seen something peculiar enough to make him stop and stare, and so he yells to his son, "Hey, what do you see?" And the son just points at the back right leg of the statue. And so the father thinks this is really weird, so he jogs up to his son and he crouches down right next to him and looks in the direction his son is pointing. And at first, the father believes all his son is pointing at is this fairly obvious crack on the outside of the statue on the back right leg. And he's thinking his son has just noticed that the statue is kind of falling apart. But as he's looking at this crack that his son is pointing at, he realized his son was not pointing at the crack. He was pointing at what was behind the crack, what was inside the dinosaur statue. And when the father realized what he was looking at, he grabbed his son, stood up, and ran in the other direction and called emergency services. A few minutes later, the police and fire department show up in front of this old theater. They get out and they go up to the statue and they confirm what's inside this back right leg. Afterwards, they go to their trucks and they get out chainsaws. Eventually, they were able to carve a big enough square on this back right leg that they were able to remove the thing that the father and the son had seen originally, and that was a dead man's body. Not much is known about this dead man, except that he was a 39-year-old man who his family had reported missing a couple of days before he was actually found. While we don't know this for sure, it's believed he decided to crawl inside the statue when he realized the belly of the dinosaur was movable. Now, it's not entirely clear how he figured that out. Either the belly was already moved and he saw the opening and so saw the opportunity to crawl inside for some reason, or he was poking and prodding at the statue and discovered the belly was movable, moved it aside, and then again seized the opportunity and crawled inside. But either way, the man crawled inside the statue, and then once he was in the dinosaur, his phone slipped out of his hand or slipped out of his pocket, and then instead of falling out of the dinosaur onto the ground, it fell inside the dinosaur and slid down the inside of the statue until it fell into the bottom of the bottom right-hand leg. And so the man decides to go after his phone, and so on his belly, he slides over to the back right leg, and then he begins lowering himself head first into the leg, reaching for his phone. And so as he's kind of slowly lowering himself down, using his legs to pin himself inside the statue, he gets closer and closer, and he's almost about to grab his phone when his feet lose their grip, and he slips and falls headfirst all the way to the bottom of this back right leg. The space he was in was so tight, he was not able to turn himself around and climb up and out again. In fact, it was so tight, he could barely move. His arms were pinned by his side, and so he couldn't use them to even push himself back up and out. And because he could not bend his legs, he could not use his legs to pull himself back out again either. And so this man most likely began screaming for help, but for whatever reason, nobody heard him. And so after what must have been several agonizing days, the man finally just died. His autopsy has not been made public, so we don't know for sure what actually killed him, although one could speculate he died of either dehydration or perhaps asphyxia from being trapped in this really tight space where his chest may not have been able to expand all the way, and so he would have eventually suffocated. Following the gruesome discovery, the dinosaur statue was removed from the front of the old. In 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin.
Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the two older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the two girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. That's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off, and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. Sir named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. He arrived in country, he got a rental car, and he hired a guide to take him out to the area where he knew this cave was going to be. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook where he had taken notes the last time he was here, and he used that to find the opening to the cave. He paid the guide to stick around at the car while he went down and explored this cave. He assured him it was not going to be for a very long time. The shaft was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. The visibility inside of the shaft was limited because all you had was the light that was coming in, and because of how narrow the opening was, Jeff's body would obscure a lot of the sunlight coming in. So once Jeff got a few meters down into the tunnel, he would rely on his headlamp. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. So that's where the tunnel goes from being on an angle to being straight. And he's about to make that final descent down that final 30 meters when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. And he looks around him and he realizes from his position down on the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. As much as Jeff wanted to stop right there and go right back up to the surface, he couldn't. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters to the bottom, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath, and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. He saw them on the rope, he's trying to brush them off. He finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up, and he begins making his way back up. And the whole time, he's just brushing spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off to get all the spiders off of his clothing. He takes his bag, dumps it out, more spiders are in there. After he finally brushes all the spiders off, He redresses and gets in the car. And you can only imagine what the guide was thinking as he's watching this guy, this foreigner, taking his clothes off after being in this cave. But luckily, he doesn't get bit. He gets in the car with the guide and they start heading back towards the city. As they're driving, he takes his notebook out and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. He scratches that out, and on top of it, he writes, the entrance to... The earth collapses in on itself, creating a hole in the ground that sucks away anything in its wake. That's called a sinkhole. These holes form when water dissolves the rock layer underneath the soil. They range dramatically in size, from a barely noticeable depression in the ground to massive chasms that are hundreds of meters wide and deep. If you're one of the unfortunate few that falls into a large sinkhole, you probably won't get out again, because the ground inside of a sinkhole after the initial implosion just continues to sink. So if you were standing on the ground inside of a sinkhole, you would continuously be pulled into the ground as it continued to crumble and churn like quicksand below your feet. And even if you managed to get to the sides inside of the sinkhole, you could not climb up again because there wouldn't be any handholds because the soil is all loose and wet. Luckily, most sinkholes form slowly and show lots of warning signs, allowing people to get away before it opens up. But there are unique circumstances where large sinkholes can appear out of nowhere. In Russia, hot water is piped into business and residential buildings during the harsh winters. On November 19th, 2019, in the Russian city of Penza, which is 340 miles south of Moscow, a large hot water pipe burst underground below a car park. Initially, nobody knew the pipe had burst, but witnesses would later say they saw steam coming out of the ground near the car park, but they didn't think anything of it. A few minutes after the steam appeared, 49-year-old Vladimir Volyelkin was driving his car through the car park. With him was his co-worker, 53-year-old Igor Chikasov. They worked together at a furniture store. As they made their way towards the exit of this car park, there was another car ahead of them that rolled over that section of pavement that was steaming, and they watched as it rolled over and drove off, and nothing happened. And so Vladimir and Igor, they drove over that section of pavement and the ground collapsed under them. The burst hot water pipe had injected thousands of gallons of water into the soil right under the pavement, and so it caused a sinkhole. But not just any sinkhole, a sinkhole that was slowly filling with boiling water. When the ground collapsed under Igor's car, it flipped the car forward and it landed upside down at the bottom of this 10-meter deep sinkhole. And it landed just perfectly to where the doors could not open. They would hit the sides of the sinkhole, which also meant they couldn't roll the windows down and crawl out because they would hit the sides of the sinkhole. The men managed to get their seatbelts off and flip themselves around and began kicking on the windshield and yelling out for help. At this point, onlookers had made it to the edge of the sinkhole, and when they looked down inside, they realized there was nothing anyone could do. Jumping in was a death sentence. So they watched in horror as Vladimir and Igor desperately tried to escape, but the scalding water continued to fill the hole until it began leaking into the cabin of the vehicle, at which point the men went quiet. A few moments later, the car completely disappeared from view under the boiling water. Although not held criminally responsible, the water company that owned the pipe that burst offered to pay compensation to both families as well as cover all funeral costs. In 2017, Daniel Beckwith was a 27-year-old genius hacker and prolific Bitcoin day trader. He was living in his modest childhood home in Bethesda, Maryland, with a multi-million-dollar fortune to his name. And he was hiding something major in his basement that, when it was discovered by authorities, he would be convicted of one of the rarest criminal charges in the American legal justice system. But to understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Daniel was born in 1991 to his eccentric and brilliant parents, Linda and David. He would be their only child. David was a PhD and an accomplished opera singer that had trained under a famous French composer, and he had also performed at the White House. Linda was a Columbia Law School trained lawyer who at one time had been a government attorney, but she gave it up because she described it as a scummy profession, and she became a vocalist like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, he learned how to read, so it was clear he had unusually high intellect, which Linda guarded fiercely. She decided that public schools were not capable of teaching her son, and so she decided she would homeschool him. By the time Daniel was just 5 years old, he was consuming entire novels, and shortly after that, he was able to break down and reprogram his PlayStation. But despite his incredible intelligence, Daniel had a really lonely childhood. He was rarely allowed to go outside and play with other kids, and on the rare chance that he was, his parents always hovered around him the entire time. And few playmates, or adults for that matter, ever came inside of Daniel's house because Daniel's parents were big-time hoarders. You couldn't take 2 steps into that house before knocking into a big stack of papers or books or old food containers. In 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which left Linda, his mother, to take care of both of them. And in that time, Linda became obsessed with protecting their property. And so anytime anyone walked in front of their house, just near their property, she would run outside and yell at them until they ran away. But despite their eccentricities, it was clear to anybody that knew the Beckwith family that Linda and David just adored Daniel. They just could not give him any space. One neighbor recalled seeing the 3 Beckwiths out trick-or-treating one year, all wearing these same matching hamster outfits. And this was well into Daniel's teenage years. Daniel loved his parents, but it was in those later teenage years that he started to realize just how smothering they really were, and so he began looking for other places to connect with new people. And he found a new community on an online forum called 4chan. There, Daniel got to reinvent himself. He adopted this kind of tough guy, genius persona where he bragged about finishing most of high school by the time he was 15, and that nowadays he just blows stuff up in his backyard to test his chemistry know-how. But over the years of posting on this channel, Daniel would occasionally let his guard down, and he would talk about something that was really close to him, that pervaded his thoughts at all times, and would ultimately be his downfall, and that was his extreme fear of death. Daniel's isolation looked like it might come to an end in 2010 when he enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the Amtrak train station with all of his stuff for college. They said their goodbyes. Daniel hopped on the train and he waved to them as they disappeared, and he likened that experience to being set free. It was the first time he was going to be without his parents for any amount of time. But unfortunately, after only being at school for a couple of months, he had to go right back home again because his mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she had hid it from Daniel. In fact, she had hid it from everyone and not even seen a doctor. And so when Daniel got home, she was in really bad shape, and she passed away 2 weeks later. Including Daniel, only 3 people showed up for her funeral. And so Daniel, with his mismatched clothes and his pants that were too short, he gave his mother's eulogy, and in it, he just looked dazed, and he actually said, "I feel lost." And then shortly after Daniel went back to school, his father began declining rapidly from Parkinson's disease, and so Daniel had to put him into assisted living. And so living by himself at his apartment in college, Daniel was overcome with grief, and now more than ever, he was just terrified of death because now he had seen it up close with his mother, and he was watching his father wither away. And so he went back on 4chan and he began talking about taking a more defensive position against his own death. What that translated to is Daniel began researching what the most common killers were for people his age, and he discovered that car accidents were a big killer. And so he reinforced all the doors of his car with Kevlar plates, and anytime he drove it, he wore a Kevlar vest, which he believed protected him from blunt force trauma in the event of a crash. Knowing that cancer was a big killer, he went out and removed every mole on his body as a preventative measure. But what Daniel viewed as the biggest threat to his life was not something that statisticians would tell you is something people his age or people in his country should be worried about, and that was a nuclear attack on the United States. Daniel believed it was imminent. Daniel believed the only way he could protect himself was to build a proper fallout shelter, and because his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, he had the means to construct one. And so he left college and went back to his home. He went down into the basement and he picked a spot right in the middle of the ground and he began digging. Over the next 2 years, Daniel spent part of his time living at college, being a really good student, and the other half of his time was spent living at his family home, hiring different contractors to come in and dig out this massive labyrinth of tunnels underneath his property. But in 2012, his schoolwork and his tunnel work had to come to a complete stop because he got in trouble with the law. Professors at Daniel's school began reporting that somebody was sneaking into their office, hacking into their computer, and then sending these really inappropriate and embarrassing emails to everybody in their contact list, which was primarily former and current students and faculty. And then whoever it was that was hacking their computer was then supergluing their door shut. After several months of investigating, the police finally got a suspect when students on campus said, yeah, Daniel Beckwith is actually a prolific hacker, and he just spoke at a hacker conference, so he seems like someone who would be capable of doing this. And so a detective went to Daniel's apartment apartment to pay him a casual visit, but Daniel wasn't there or didn't come to the door, and the detective looked down and saw a package that was sitting there that was addressed to S. Loomis Detweiler. The detective believed this could be an alias for Daniel Beckwith, and so he went back and they ran that name, and sure enough, it was connected to an online persona that had recently been bragging about breaking into their professor's offices and hacking into their emails. So the police used this information to attain a search warrant. They went back to Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there. They used the key they had been given for the unit. They went inside and they're hit with just this ridiculous mess of an apartment. It looked exactly like Daniel's home growing up, with stacks of papers and books and wires and computer equipment and trash and old food containers. And there was just this dirty mattress sitting right in the middle of the apartment with no sheets on it. And in the back, on top of a mini fridge, was Daniel's laptop. It was open and it was unsecured, so they logged into it, cloned his hard drive, and left. And using the information that was contained on this hard drive, detectives were able to, without a doubt, connect Daniel to the vandalism and hacking that had been taking place at his college. Daniel was arrested and charged with a number of serious felonies, but shortly before his trial, Daniel struck a plea deal and then immediately took to Reddit to tell the world that he fully expected the state governor to pardon him because he had made a number of significant contributions to his campaign. But that pardon never came. However, Daniel's sentence was remarkably light. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the college and then was given 2 years of probation. Daniel was expelled from his school, and so he moved back into his childhood home where he lived alone full time. Once home, Daniel focused his efforts on this bunker he was building in his basement, which by now was a fairly large series of tunnels that zigged and zagged in different directions well beyond his property lines. Once Daniel hired a couple good contractors to continue to expand this bunker, he turned his attention to a new activity, Bitcoin trading. And in relative short order, Daniel became extremely good at this and made millions of dollars. By 2015, Daniel was off probation. His bunker was almost completely built out, although he did have plans at some point to hire more people and continue to expand it. And in terms of Bitcoin day trading, he wasn't doing it as much because he had made so much money. Now he just spent his time sitting inside of his bunker, live streaming on this new website called Blab about his investment prowess. And every time Daniel live streamed, he was cautious to never reveal his identity. And so he used the username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter, and he wore a large fire protection hood over his face, and he used a voice changer. Within his small but avid following on Blab, there was one 19-year-old named Askia Kafra who completely idolized Daniel, even though he only knew him as 3-Alarm. Askia was from a middle-class home, and he was the son of immigrants from Trinidad. He also lived only 15 minutes away from Daniel, but he didn't know that because Daniel never gave up where he lived because he was so obsessed with protecting himself against a potential nuclear attack. He just told people he lived in some underground bunker in the middle of Virginia somewhere. Askia longed to be successful and rich, which is part of the reason he idolized Daniel so much. When he was 18 years old, he received a $100,000 settlement for a lead poisoning case, and he for a second got to live the life of someone rich and famous, and he blew it immediately on expensive dinners and rented Mercedes and BMW cars. And once the money was all gone, he was certain he could get it all back. And his big plan is he was going to build an app called Equity Shark, which is basically crowdfunding that allowed people to invest small amounts of money into new promising startups. And he believed this app was going to be the way he made not millions, but billions of dollars. But he didn't have any real money to fund this app. And so he and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs that have dropped out of college, something Askia had just done, and they were certain they were going to get this grant. But despite Askia's confidence, he was far from a sure bet for this money, because Askia still had many of the blind spots of someone still learning how to become an adult. And one of his biggest blind spots was how quick he was to trust people. And so it was shortly after Askia and his business partner had applied for this $100,000 grant that Askia came across Daniel on Blab, and he was so taken with him, and he's got all this money, and he's so successful. And that's when Daniel told his followers that he was open to new investments. And so Askia, who wanted to get closer to Daniel and figured he could use some additional money because even when they got this $100,000 grant, they would need more money to build the business, he decided he would ask Daniel if he and his business partner could pitch him on Equity Shark, and Daniel agreed. And so in June of 2016, Askia and his business partner went to this hookah bar that was about 20 minutes away from Askia's home, and there they sat, waiting for 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter to walk through the door. And they didn't know what he was going to look like, because whenever they saw him on his live streams, he had that big fire protection hood on, but as soon as Daniel walked through the door, They immediately knew it was him because he had this comically bulky shirt on where it was obvious he had a bulletproof vest on. And so this guy with the bulletproof vest walks over, introduces himself as 3 Alarm, aka Daniel. And so by now, Askia and his business partner are very accustomed to 3 Alarm's eccentricities like his bulletproof vest. They just kind of overlook it and begin pitching him on Equity Shark. And they tell him that the success of the company, they believe, is hinged on this $100,000 grant that they explained they are certain to get. They meet all the parameters. They are exactly what they're looking for. And at the end of the conversation, Daniel was convinced that not only were they going to get this $100,000 grant, but that Equity Shark seemed like a great investment. And so after a number of follow-on meetings, Daniel ultimately committed $5,000 to Equity Shark, and he told Askia that they would have to pay him back with the funds from the $100,000 grant, or if for some reason that didn't come through, Askia and his business partner would have to find another way to pay back Daniel. Askia and his business partner were totally thrilled. They felt like that $100,000 grant is a done deal, so there's no risk to this investment by Daniel. And shortly after they secured the $5,000, the manager of the $100,000 grant program called Askia and said, hey, you guys have made it to the second round of applicants. We need you to fly out to San Francisco and pitch your company to us. And so they're totally excited. They tell Daniel that everything's progressing exactly as they planned. And they fly out to the West Coast, but they book their flight to LAX, not to the airport in San Francisco. So they land 400 miles south of where they needed to be. And so they're cussing themselves for being so stupid about this. And they realize they can't even rent a car. They're not old enough to rent a car. But they were old enough to rent a U-Haul. So they rent this huge U-Haul and they start bombing up the coast towards San Francisco to make this meeting in time, but they plugged the wrong address into their GPS and did not go to the right building. They went in the opposite direction. And so by the time they finally got all the way back to the meeting place in San Francisco, it was too late, and the manager that was waiting for them was clearly upset about it and said, just go home, we'll be in touch by phone. Back home, Askia was totally embarrassed when he told Daniel about their botched trip, and he was convinced that they were not going to get the grant now because of how badly they had screwed up the meeting. And so Askia began asking Daniel if he would give them more money, because maybe if they use that additional money to bolster the app and make it more appealing, they will have a better chance at getting that $100,000 grant. Daniel eventually said he would commit more money, but Askia picked up that he was really hesitant and just seemed not to be very interested in Equity Shark anymore. And so Askia, hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and wanting to make sure he was confident in this investment, he said, hey, let me do something for you. I heard on one of the channels online that you're looking to expand some of the tunnels inside of your bunker. Let me do that for you. Daniel, who was looking to expand his bunker, was eager to hire Askia, but he told him that if you're going to work for me, there's going to be heavy restrictions on how this goes, because it's a very secret location. I don't want this to leak out, where my bunker is, because as you know, there's going to be a nuclear attack on the United States any day, and my bunker is one of the only places that's going to be safe. Askia said that was totally fine. He would do whatever Daniel needed. So on January 28th, 2017, just after 2 a.m., Askia sat outside his house waiting for some car to come pick him up. And at some point, Daniel showed up in a minivan and he walked up to Askia, he led him into the van, and then he put goggles that were blacked out on his head. And then Daniel drove around in loops up on the highway and background neighborhoods, giving the impression to Askia that they were actually going somewhere far outside of Maryland, but really they were only going 15 minutes away to Daniel's actual house. And when they got to Daniel's house, Daniel made Askia keep the goggles on. Daniel got out and he led Askia by a string into the house, and once they got inside, Daniel had to carefully walk him around all the junk that was piled up all over the house. They made their way all the way to the back. They went down the stairs into the basement, where Daniel had intentionally created this unbelievable maze all over the basement floor with chicken wire and stacks of bikes and books and more junk. It was designed so anybody who was working inside of the tunnels, that even once they came out of the exit, wouldn't even know how to get out of the basement. And finally, after bringing Askia all the way through this maze, he stopped him right in front of this hole in the ground that was the entrance into the underground tunnels. And at that point, he told Askia to remove his goggles. Daniel told him to hop down and take a look. So Askia hopped down and he's looking around and he's seeing these massive tunnel systems pushing out in all directions, and all of it is extremely well lit. And he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And he's looking at Daniel like, how far does this go? And Daniel said, it's huge. It was at this point that Daniel handed down to Askia a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. And he explained to him that anytime you're in the tunnels, I'm going to have to cover over this hole because I can't even have you in the basement. It's too much of a security threat for me. And in fact, I'd prefer it if you worked multiple days in a row, because doors anytime you leave. We're going to have to do the whole blindfold thing. And so you should anticipate living in the tunnels for days at a stretch. But don't worry, there's a mattress down there, there's Wi-Fi, everything's well lit up, and there's a 5-gallon bucket if you need to go to the bathroom. And so Askia, who trusted Daniel, didn't love this setup, but in a weird way, he was just kind of excited to be a part of this guy's life, this guy who he believed was just this really amazing person. And so over the following winter and spring, Askia would make the blindfold commute all the way to Daniel's house 15 minutes away, and then he would spend multiple days down in the tunnel chiseling away into these different tunnels that Daniel wanted expanded. But as well as it was going working for Daniel, Askia was dealt some bad news at the end of the spring when it turned out Equity Shark was turned down for that $100,000 grant. Askia was surprised, he was crushed, and he now knew he would have to pay back that $5,000 that Daniel had invested in Equity Shark because he wasn't getting it from the $100,000 anymore. And so he asked Daniel if he could increase his hours in the tunnel to try to pay back that debt. Daniel agreed, and so on September 10th, Askia was back at Daniel's house, and he was down inside the tunnels in one of the lowest sections that required squeezing through a very narrow section that Askia had actually texted his friends about and said that section made him really claustrophobic, but he had to do it. He needed to pay back the debt. And so later that day at 4 p.m., when Askia was down in that lower section, the power in the tunnel suddenly went completely out. It was pitch black. And so Daniel, who was upstairs, recognized it happened. And so he navigated through all the junk upstairs, came downstairs, navigated the maze all the way to the circuit breaker in the basement, and he flipped the switch. And the power went on, but Daniel heard a loud buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. And so worried that could be an electrical fire, he turned back off the circuit breaker, putting Askia back in total darkness down deep inside of this tunnel. And Daniel went back through this really epic maze in the basement, went up the stairs into the kitchen to investigate the buzzing sound, and as soon as he left the basement, he could smell smoke. And he turned around and looked down into the basement, and he could clearly see smoke was filling the basement. And so Daniel ran downstairs and he yelled out for Askia, and somewhere way down in the tunnels, he heard Askia yell out, "Hey dude, what's going on?" And Daniel's like, "Come on, you gotta get out of there." But he was totally overcome with smoke, and Daniel had to run back upstairs, ran outside, he caught his breath, and then he charged back into the house, down into the basement. But as soon as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he didn't see Askia, but he saw flames leaping out of the entrance into the tunnels. And he knew Askia was down there, and he's screaming for Askia to get out, but he didn't hear from him. And at some point, Daniel just had to turn around and leave because he was totally overcome with the heat and the smoke. A neighbor saw Daniel come running out. They saw the smoke coming out of his house, and so they called 911. And so while Daniel paced outside screaming for Askia, Askia is down in total darkness. There's smoke filling up the tunnels, and he began making his way across that very tight section. But once he got out of there, he had no idea where to go because this tunnel system was huge and all the power was out, so it's pitch black, and there's smoke inside of the tunnel. And so he desperately starts crawling all over the tunnel. He's hitting dead ends, and finally, miraculously, he makes it to the exit of the tunnels. Everything around him is on fire. He leaps out, but now he's in a basement that's covered in smoke, and every time he had been led to that point in the basement, he had been blindfolded. He didn't know how to navigate the maze, and so he's looking out and it's all smoky, and all he can see is there's one window on the far side that he might be able to get to. And so he starts leaping over the chicken wire and the bikes, and he sneaks past a furnace, and it's just flames and smoke all around him, and he gets to this little shimmer of light, which is the window, except he realizes there have been metal bars placed in front of it. There's no way to get through it. But in his desperation, he grabbed a rolly chair and he put it in front. He climbed on top and he managed to break the glass, but then he couldn't get through the bars. And eventually, after a number of agonizing minutes, he fell backwards and was consumed by the flames. After the fire was finally put out and Askia's body was finally found inside of the basement underneath that window, investigators didn't understand how Askia couldn't have gotten out of the basement. And Daniel tried to lie about it and say, "Oh, well, he might have been asleep. That's his bachelor pad down there." But eventually, as investigators were looking for the cause of the fire, they uncovered the entrance to this massive tunnel system. And that's when they realized Daniel had put Askia effectively into a death trap. When the fire started, Askia was at the bottom of this tunnel system, and so he had to navigate all the way back up to the top, killing all this precious time as the fire grows. And then he finally got into the basement, and there's flames everywhere, but he has no idea how to navigate the maze Daniel had made down there. And so he managed to get to the window because it was the only thing he could see, but of course Daniel had put bars in front of it, and so Askia had nowhere else to go, and he just died. The investigators would point out that where he died, he was only 2 steps away from almost certain safety. He just didn't know it. After an 8-month investigation, prosecutors charged Daniel with involuntary manslaughter as well as one of the rarest charges in the American justice system. It's called second-degree depraved heart murder, where Daniel's disregard for human life was so extreme it amounted to willful killing. And so he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, green greasy, the Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Phalaborwa sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Phalaborwa resident Mariska Buitendog, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, so as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, "Hey, who wants to come with me for a 3rd time in?" And the group said, "No, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe." And she said, "I don't care, I'm going in for a 3rd time." So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa. And many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River. And inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to cross.
In the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. And the boys, they asked their stepfather, like, "Where is she? Where's she gone?" But the stepdad would say, "I don't know, she went out on an errand and she never came back." And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do. Like, she would not abandon them. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. Now, the boys would contact police, and specifically they said, like, "Hey, we think something happened to our mom. We think maybe our stepdad had something to do with it, but everybody's abandoned us." And the police would launch an investigation and they would go looking for their mother, but they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the stepfather or the biological father. And so after the police wound down their investigation, the two boys, again, they've been orphaned now and they, learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. They really didn't know what happened to her. And so today, the two brothers had met up, not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. So after their mother and stepfather and their biological father had abandoned them, the two boys had lived in the childhood home on their own, fending for themselves. They had grown up there. And then eventually, when they were old enough, they had moved out and started their own adult lives on their own, but they had never sold the house. They had just kind of kept it in their possession and let it sit there. But now they were going back to, go through and sort of clean it up and, decide if they wanted to do some renovations and just kind of fix the place up, maybe to sell it. They didn't know. And so the two brothers, they met up at the home, they go inside and, there's still photos on the wall, old family photos. And there's, all these memories that come rushing back, many of which are very sad and troubling. But, like the brothers, they're having a good time, just kind of going down memory lane. And at some point they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. Like the place has been sitting here for years. It's sort of fallen into disrepair. Let's fix this place up. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house while the brothers continued to clean it up and pack things up and sort of get it ready for whatever it was going to be. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing, when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. And so the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. And suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all, is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the two brothers went to police in Mexico City and told them what happened. And the police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out, what happened to their mother, who killed her. But they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead.
The Japanese famously attacked Pearl Harbor, the US military base in Hawaii. But Pearl Harbor was not the only US base attacked by the Japanese that month. In fact, just hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese shifted gears and attacked US military personnel on Wake Island, which is a coral atoll in the northern Pacific Ocean. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese had taken Wake Island from the Americans, and they sent the majority of American military personnel and American civilian contractors to prisoner of war camps in Asia. But they retained 98 of these POWs to stay on the island and fortify defenses. Over the next couple of years, the Americans would periodically bomb Wake Island, but there was never any concerted effort to take it back from the Japanese. However, that all changed on October 5th, 1943, when the Americans decided it was time to take it back. They launched a huge air raid on the island that was so violent, the Japanese admiral on Wake Island was convinced a full-scale invasion was imminent. And so in his paranoia, he ordered the 98 POWs they had retained on the island to be executed. And so they marched these 98 POWs to the edge of the sea, they blindfolded them, and then they gunned them down. But in the chaos of the air raid and the execution, one of the American POWs somehow managed to escape. After the Japanese had left the area, this POW snuck back down to the execution site, and he carved into the rock a memorial for all 98 of the POWs. So he was including himself in that number because I'm sure he knew he would eventually be recaptured.
This was a small area, and he was the only American there. And sure enough, this POW was recaptured that day, and he was personally executed by the Japanese admiral. The identity of this POW has never been determined. After the war ended, the Japanese admiral that ordered these executions was tried for war crimes, found guilty, and put to death himself. The so-called 98 Rock can still be seen on Wake Island today. 1st, 2014, Darsh Patel, who was a 22-year-old college student, was out hiking in a New Jersey state park along with 5 of his college buddies. As they were about to head down a particular trail that they had actually gone to this park to go down, a man and woman come charging up the path towards them. And so Darsh and his friends stop, and they're looking at these two people who look totally distraught and scared. And the man and woman immediately say, "Hey, don't go down this path. We were just down there, and for the past 10 minutes, a black bear has been stalking us in the tree line. We don't know where it went, but we got up here, we turned around, and it was gone, but we would not suggest going down this path. It's just not worth it." Darsh and his friends tell the couple, "Thank you for giving us the heads up. We were actually going to go down that path, and so I guess now we won't." And so the couple, they quickly leave, and Darsh and his friends are sitting there thinking, well, now what do we do? Because this was the trail we were going to go down. This is why we're here. As they're standing there, they start talking about, well, maybe we just go down anyways. There's 6 of us. I highly doubt that a bear is going to come out of the woods and attack 6 people, especially a black bear that is not known to attack people. Why don't we just walk down a ways, and if we see the bear, then we just turn around and leave. And if we see the bear, might make some good pictures. Let's just go down there and see what happens." And they start walking. And sure enough, about 10 minutes into their trip down this trail, they see this massive bear parked right in the center of the trail, about 250 meters away from where they were. The bear did not appear to be doing anything. It was just sitting there, but it was clearly looking at the group of them. So Darsh and his friends are just standing there, not really sure what to do, so they start taking pictures and videos. They're not moving any closer, but they just start documenting what they're seeing because this bear was apparently stalking this couple. It was pretty interesting, and they figured, hey, make some good pictures. So they start taking pictures and taking some videos of this animal, and the animal starts walking towards them. Now it's 250 meters away. They recognize that this is a dangerous animal, and we don't want to get too close to it, but they felt relatively safe. Even if it started moving towards them initially, they still felt safe. But the animal starts jogging towards them. At this point, the boys put their phones away, turn around, and they start hightailing it the other way. And somebody looks back and notices the bear is now sprinting at them. This causes the group to completely panic. They start sprinting back towards where their cars were parked. Absolute full panic back up the trail. No one's paying attention to anybody else. They're just running for their lives. And as they're turning their heads to look, the bear is gaining on them and gaining on them. Finally, after about 10 minutes of just running for their lives, they make it to the parking lot and they turn around. There's no bear, but there's short one hiker. Darsh Patel is still in the forest somewhere. The group starts screaming for Darsh. They know there was this aggressive bear in there chasing them, so they're obviously worried about him potentially getting attacked, and so they immediately call 911. The police show up and park rangers show up, and they go into the forest to try to find this bear and to find Darsh. And very quickly they come across this bear in a clearing, this 300-pound bear all by itself, aggressively pacing around this lump in the middle of this clearing that had sticks and branches on it. It wasn't clear what it was, and this bear is just pacing in a circle around this thing. And as these 2 park rangers get closer, they're armed. The bear looks at them and makes a move like it's going to charge, and they elect to shoot and kill this bear. Later, the bear's remains would be taken to a laboratory, and inside of the bear's stomach was Darsh Patel. He had been killed and eaten by this bear, and that lump that was on the ground that the bear was circling was whatever was left of Darsh that had not been consumed yet. When they recovered Darsh Patel's phone, they went into his images, and they found he had taken one final picture before he was attacked. Here it is. The bear was not malnourished, it was not diseased, it just decided it wanted to stalk, kill, and eat a human. Unfold at 8:49 a.m. on April 16th, 2014. The Seawall ferry that was on a routine trip to Jeju Island in South Korea was beginning to lean very badly to one side. The ferry had recently undergone illegal renovations, adding a whole bunch of new rooms to the top of the ferry that made it much more profitable, but dangerously top-heavy. Corrupt regulators who were bought off with fancy dinners and travel allowed the ship to sail unsafe despite never having stepped foot on board.
Had they gone on the ship themselves, they would have seen immediately how unsafe it was. On April 16th, the day this ferry is making its way to Jeju Island and is now leaning to one side, ferry workers had loaded twice the legal limit onto the ferry and then hadn't properly secured really any of it. So there were cars and shipping containers that were not tethered. So as the badly balanced seawall ferry is making its way out to Jeju Island, it hits some very strong currents and makes a sharp turn to avoid them, causing the ship to begin to keel over. As soon as it begins to keel over, all those unsecured cars and containers all shift all at once to one side of the ship, causing it to completely roll over on its side and begin sinking. On board were 476 passengers, of which 325 were high school students on a school trip. As soon as the ship comes to rest on its side, the captain comes over the intercom and tells everybody to stay in your rooms and await further instruction. And everybody listens. They all stay in their room. And honestly, you can't blame them because they're on a routine ferry trip that happens dozens of times a day without any incident. And the captain of the ship is telling you everything's fine. You just stay where you are. We'll tell you what to do next. After a little while, a lot of the students start to feel a little bit anxious because there's been no further instruction. They're still sideways, and they're starting to realize that if they needed to, it would be hard to get out of the ship. A lot of them were way into the bowels of the ship, and they would literally need to climb up and out of the ship to safety. A student actually called the authorities and said, "Hey, I think the ship I'm on is sinking." And the authorities hadn't heard of it because the captain and the crew of the ship were just totally crippled and could not make a decision and had wasted all this time that they could have been evacuating people and getting help, and instead were just panicked and frozen in terror. There would be over 20 calls from students pleading with authorities to come save them because now they know the ship is sinking because they can hear the sound of water rushing into the ship, and it's just a matter of time before it reaches them. Finally, almost an hour after the ship had originally keeled over onto its side, the captain issues the evacuation call to the whole ship. But at this point, water's already getting into the compartments where these students have been told to stay, and students aren't able to leave, and there's this panic to get out of the ship. So the evacuation order was doing nothing. It was already too late. One person who survived, who had left early and disobeyed the stay in your room order, they had climbed to the top of the ship, which was really the side of the ship, and they were looking down into the ship through a hallway. And they said there was this mass of people that were coming out of their rooms and trying to climb up this hallway right as a rush of water poured in through the side of this hallway and completely filled it, and they were gone. Later on, when divers would go down to recover the bodies, they would find that many of the students had broken fingers from desperately trying to climb up those hallways when water was pouring in on them. After the divers recovered the bodies, investigators began going through their cell phones to get some sense of what happened. And on their phones were these tragic pictures and videos of these students staying in their rooms like they were told to do, just waiting for their captain to give them further instruction that never came. The captain actually abandoned ship right after that 9:30 call to evacuate came when hundreds of students were still down below. He left the ship. So they were totally on their own, just waiting for help that never came. Of the 476 passengers, 304 would perish, and many believe that almost all of them could have been saved had they just evacuated as soon as the ship keeled over. And so as a result of his gross negligence, the captain was given a life sentence. 10-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her two friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, "Yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do." And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her two friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that, because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory. And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case, and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system, and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over. She was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. 2016, 62-year-old Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was ushered into a famous art museum in Turkey. There, Andrei was going to deliver a speech at the opening of an exhibition of Turkish photography that featured the Russian countryside. Andrei had been a Russian government employee for the past 40 years, spending much of his time in North Korea, but in 2013 he took this post as the ambassador to Turkey. Although he was a seasoned diplomat, he knew there was a lot riding on this visit. His appearance there was following several days of protests by Turks against Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. Andrei was there to ease the strain in Turkish-Russian relations as officials from both countries met to broker a ceasefire in Syria. As Andrei made his way across the room, he had a lot of things on his mind, but one thing he wasn't concerned about was his own safety. The museum had state-of-the-art security cameras, and everyone who was going to be attending his speech had been carefully screened and vetted. Andrei was also protected by his own personal bodyguards that were these men in dark suits that fanned out around him as he stepped up to the microphone. The bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit, and over the past year, he had been asked 8 separate times to be on the personal security detail of the Turkish president. Andrei looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andre's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. It would turn out Mevlut was not a part of Andrei Karlov's security detail. He was actually off duty, but had used his police credentials to get into the exhibit hall. His exact motive for the assassination is unclear. Some think it was revenge for Russia's targeting of rebel-held areas in Aleppo. Others say the shooting was designed to disrupt warming relations between Turkey and Russia. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. Here is that photo. Firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked, and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns, and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin, because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. 1861, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together, as they were both avid outdoorsmen. And so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they are just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? You know, we're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. You know, this is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, you know, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, you know, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, you know, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away.